Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. I'm really excited about today's guest, the lovely Jyoti Patel. I absolutely adored Jyoti's debut novel, The Things That We Lost. It left me feeling seen, inspired, and hopeful. It covers a range of important themes, including mental health, grief, friendship, identity, and family. Jyoti Patel's debut novel is told from the perspectives of 18-year-old Nick and his British-Indian mother, Avani, flitting between the past and present as Nick searches for answers surrounding the circumstances of his father's death. An extract of the novel was selected as the winning submission out of over 2,000 entries for the 2021 Merky Books New Writers Prize. Recently, Jyoti was selected as one of the Observer's 10 Best New Novelists for 2023. She is also a graduate of the Creative Writing Prose Fiction MA from the University of East Anglia and currently lives in London. Hi, Jyoti. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
And congratulations, a huge congratulations on the publication of your book, The Things That We Lost. It's just come out very recently. So I'm really excited about it. And I can see you've been doing lots of fun stuff as well. So huge congratulations.
Thank you. It's been such a fun couple of weeks getting it out, and even the lead up to when it was published and the launch and then lots of promo afterwards. So I'm so happy that after so many years of working on it, I can walk past my local bookshop and see it on the shelf. It's just a very special feeling.
Oh, that's really nice. I'm sure it's really great. I read the book and I've loved it, and I've seen readers are picking it up and really enjoying it. So for anyone listening that hasn't read it, tell us a little bit about your lovely novel.
Thank you. So, the novel's called The Things That We Lost, and it's published with Merky Books, which is an imprint of Penguin. So Stormzy set up Merky Books with Penguin in order to sort of give more diverse voices and basically a chance to get published and create space on British bookshelves for stories that weren't being told. Now, I won something called the Merky Books New Writers Prize in April 2021, and that's part of Merky Books's annual sort of prize to find an unpublished writer who's aged 16 to 30. So I won that just under 2 years ago now. That was a big moment for me because it meant that I won a book deal with Merky Books. And the last couple of years have been the process of, editing, getting the book together, and then finally it's now available on bookshelves.
That's really exciting. So you applied for the Merky Book Prize, and did you have the idea for the novel before? Where did the idea for the story come about?
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth mentioning what the story is as well. Sorry, I feel like you asked me that a second ago. I just went on a tangent. So it's a coming of age family sort of story. Follows Nick and Avani, who are mother and son. Nick's about 18, Avani's in her mid-40s. And it flits between the present, which is 2017, when Nick's growing up. He's 18, about to go to uni. And then Avani, who's in her mid-40s, as well. And then it also flits back to the 80s when Avani's growing up. And the whole story, it's about a lot of things, which I'm sure we'll get into, but the main thread running through it is Nick is trying to figure out who his father was and how his father died, because he's never met his dad. His dad dies just before he's born, and his mother won't speak to him about it. So that's the sort of premise. And I actually started writing this, to answer your question, in it was the summer of 2018. I'd always wanted to be a writer. I'd always written stories. In my early 20s, I don't know what happened, but I just stopped writing completely. I think I was just not going through a very good space, and I just let go of the idea of me being an author. And then one day I was sitting on my mum's sofa, and this idea, it was a conversation between Nick and the granddad in the book called Rohan. It just appeared to me, and I started writing it. And 3 months later, I had a very messy, unexpected draft of a novel. And I left it for 6 months, picked it up again, left it. And then I think it was probably about a year and a bit later, I went and did a master's in creative writing at the University of East Anglia, which really transformed this whole book. And that was really great. That's when I brought in Avani's perspective, because previously the book was only told from Nick's perspective. And then it was when I came out of that course that I applied for the Merky Books Prize. That was
Mm.
my journey of like when it started, when I was working on and off. It wasn't
Mm.
like I was working since 2018. Like I'd work on it for a few months, leave it, pick it up, leave it. So yeah, it's been a nice little journey.
Yeah, and that's really nice to hear actually, because I think sometimes we can assume that the idea of a book comes to you and you kind of sit down and you dedicatedly work on it and then you write it and then you have a finished book by the end of it. But obviously that that isn't the way that it happens, and it didn't happen with you.
Yeah.
But I'm really glad that the book's out there for everyone to see, to read. And so the book, obviously it has dual timelines. It deals with a lot of family relationships. Essentially, Nick is trying to uncover his family history. There's something niggling away at him. He feels that he doesn't have the answers about his father and about so many other things that have happened in his life, and he kind of wants to get to the bottom of it. And I think what is central is this relationship between mother and son, the relationship between Avani and Nick. We don't really see much of that in literature. There's lots of different kinds of relationships explored, and I guess the most common is probably mother and daughter. And we're seeing a little bit more, I think, of like a daughter and father, but not so much mother and son. And I feel like mother and son relationships are so heavily stereotyped because, we hear of like mummy's boys, and then especially like within the South Asian community, then we have this idea of like the toxic mother-in-law and like the controlling mother. But actually the relationship between Nick and Avani is really like it's so complex. And at heart is the deep love that they have for one another and Avani's desire to protect her son. So why was it so important to you to focus on this relationship between mother and son?
Yeah, so it's such a lovely question, actually. And I was really inspired by lots of the books that I was reading at the time, which, like you say, look at mother-daughter relationships. So, like Avni Doshi's Burnt Sugar, Yagyasi's Transcendent Kingdom. And then I picked up books like Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart, which looks like mother and son. But you're right, like I wasn't really seeing a nuanced relationship between mother and son in a lot of like it was rare to find books that explored that. And then, like I say, the nuance of also being a British Gujarati family. And like you say, that comes with a lot of stereotypes as well, mother and sons, and in that. And I really wanted to make sure it was important to me that this book doesn't have those stereotypes in it, and it's complex and it's nuanced, and I'm not just writing into the stereotypes of like how Gujaratis are portrayed. But I think to answer your question, like any mother-child relationship is like a thumbprint. Like it is so unique, it is so nuanced. And I think that's why it's such a right crop for writers. Like we are always going to be attracted to things like grief and death. We're always going to be attracted to relationships between lovers. We're always going to be attracted to relationships between mothers and children and parents and children, because those relationships are so interesting psychologically. And with all those things, grief, like love, mother-child relationships, like I say, each one is so nuanced, and there is no right or wrong way to process that. There is no right or wrong way really to raise a kid. Like it's so complex. And that really inspires me and really interests me. And it's something that I'm really keen to explore through my writing. And it was also really fun actually to have, as a writer, to have the chance to write a book between the perspective of a mother and son, because I'm neither of those things. Never had any kids, and I'm a daughter, but not a son. So it was fun for me to explore psychologically what it would be like for these characters. It was a challenge, but a really fun one.
Yeah, and I think because obviously we see the relationship change a lot throughout the book, and we see it kind of being really impacted by the secret, and we see Avani holding back, and she's doing it because she wants to protect her son. And actually what is explored throughout this novel is, by hiding things, are we really protecting people? And how it is that sometimes when we think we're protecting them, actually we're doing more harm.
Yeah.
I love that because it's so real, and it happens in so many ways. And we see the frustration building up in Nick, where he's so desperate for the answers, and yet Avni is also so desperate to protect him, and they're at this like just kind of like butting heads about it because neither can see it from the other's perspective until Nick kind of gets a bit more information, and then he's able to put himself in his mother's shoes. So I thought it was such a fantastic exploration of that. But you also write about the relationship between Avni and her mum.
Yeah.
Now that was actually really difficult to read because it was such a toxic relationship and it encompassed so much. So why did you decide to bring that element into it as well?
So yeah, that was difficult for readers to read, and it was also difficult for me as a writer to write that relationship between Avni and her mum, because, you know, to write that you have to experience it in your own head. I don't mean I have experienced that, but I mean in the process of writing it, I have to psychologically be in the space of both the mother and the daughter, and that's really difficult. And actually, when I wrote some of the scenes between Avani and her mother, I think there's one that stands out a lot. Like I didn't write for a few days after that, and I felt quite, because it's very difficult, I think, to read, but also to write. And I wanted to look at how Avani has become the woman that she's become. Like what has led her to become this person that we meet. And for me, I also wanted to look at, I think, like in Gujarati culture, in South Asian culture specifically, not Indian culture really, but generally the way South Asian culture is looked at by the West. There has been like a history of like the bullying father or the toxic father who doesn't want his daughter to be too British, whatever. But I wanted to look at what it was like to invert that and say, what if a mother's like this? What if it's the father who's the gentle, kind savior? What if it's the mother who's the one who is overstepping the mark, who is essentially being abusive? To look at that. That was one of the things that I wanted to explore. But I also think, you know, coming back to the point that we made before, the reason why I include all of Avni's backstory is because so Nick is at an age, right, where he's starting to ask these questions. He's starting to ask them because he's starting to see his mother as a human being outside of the fact that she's just a mother. You know, there's an interesting stage when you get to your like teens where you're like, oh my God, like my parents had lives, like my parents have names and they like have jobs and they're like more than just mum and dad. You know, like it's a very common thing, you know, when you're in your early teens, and then as you get older, you're like, oh my God, like they've made mistakes in their lives and like, they've done naughty things that they tell me not to. That's really interesting to me psychologically. Like when you start seeing the people in your life who are your caretakers as people in their own rights, Nick starts to have that with Avni. And I wanted to give the reader the backstory of Avni so that they can sort of see what's made her the woman she is. And they have the ability to pop out of Nick's head and be like, he sees her this way, but we know what's led her to become like this. And her mother is a big part of that. You know, her relationship with her mother, and then also her relationship with her brother and her dad, which are also, specifically with her brother, very complex. They were just very interesting to me to write and to explore.
Yeah. And I think what you just said now about how kind of you, as you grow up, you see your parents as people in their own right. And in my personal experience, I feel like so much of that comes with forgiveness that you were not able to show your family when you were growing up because you didn't understand where they were coming from. But kind of the older you get, the more you understand the years and the decades of struggle that they face for various reasons, especially if they're immigrant. And in Avni's case, like, you know, we see her as she's growing up and she's struggling with her identity, and she's also struggling with her mother, and she's, you know, she's seeing Elia and she cares about him, and he's going through a bunch of stuff as well. And we see that happen with Nick as well. But I guess because it's such an excruciating process for him to try and get that information, and actually it's the loss of his grandfather at the very start of the novel, which starts the whole thing off, but also feels like, oh gosh, if his grandfather had just been alive for a little bit longer, they could have had a conversation.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
could have told him everything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted like Nick to have had love. So
Mm,
like that's why we start the novel with him being so incredibly close to his grandfather and knowing that he has felt that fatherly love in his life. But then when that's taken away, he realizes, oh God, my granddad was just stepping in for my dad, really. And there's this huge hole in my life that I've not confronted, which
mm,
is the loss of my father. Because
mm,
my granddad was so overly loving and so overly, like, he compensated so much that I never really noticed that my
mm,
dad wasn't there. I noticed it a little bit and I felt it in the silences and like his granddad slips in photographs and stuff, but he doesn't really confront it. He
mm,
pushes it away. And then when his granddad dies, he's like, oh my God, I'm really now aware of this huge hole. And he's grieving not just for his granddad, but for the space that his granddad was filling too, which is
absolutely.
the space that his dad left behind. So yeah, a lot of this book is also about grief and
Mm,
the different shades of grief and the complexities around it and how that we perform our grief and that we process our grief. Or we, in Avni's case, we don't, you know.
mm,
Avni really struggles to come to terms with her husband's death. And that's also part of the reason why she can't talk about it. The big part of it is that she wants to protect her son from the pain that she feels. But it's also because she's been unable to process that. And I really hope, like, I've shown that by the end of the novel, there's some hope for her where she does begin to process it.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does seem like she
Yeah.
processes it, and Nick develops such a deep found understanding of what she's been through, and kind of he now knows how he can help her along the way as well, because sometimes if you don't know, you can't
Yeah.
help that person. As well as grief, you talk about mental health, and obviously we see kind of like Avni struggling with her mental health as she's dealing with grief, but also in the case of Elliot,
Yeah.
who had a really rough life, a really rough childhood, especially. We kind of, and then he's lost, trying to find a sibling that he's lost, and that seems to be so heavy for him. It seems to be the thing that he's not able to let go of.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting exploration because it was quite quietly done in the novel, but it was also really important to the plot. So what was that process like for you, and where did that story of Elliot come from?
Yeah, so Eliot was someone who, again, I didn't really get to know properly until I began writing from the perspective of Avni when I was working on that second draft.
Mm,
Because when I was writing it from the perspective of Nick, even though I was the author and I was in charge, I was so close to Nick's perspective, and when I was writing it, that he seemed really intangible to me too. And
mm,
it was through writing through Avni's perspective that I really unlocked his character and who he was, and again thought about his backstory and how he came to where he is when we meet him. So I look at it was interesting to me because Elliot is a British white male, and historically, men in Britain have really struggled to talk about their mental health because of
mm.
wars, because of the whole rhetoric of the whole sort of idea of this like stiff upper lip
Yeah.
and let's just crack on, guys. And I wanted to look at how that actually psychologically plays out and what that looks like from someone who's trying to support someone who's like that. And then with Nick, who also struggles a lot with his mental health, he struggles with anxiety, panic attacks. I never throughout the novel use those words because in Gujarati, we don't have words for
Mm,
depression, anxiety, panic attacks. We don't have words for mental health. And by definition, it means that, even someone like me who grew up in Britain, when I would see people from my culture struggling with those things, I would also see the people around them struggling to articulate what was happening because we
mm,
don't have the language to talk about those things. Now, with Nick, I wanted to see what happened. He is half Indian and half British. Mother is Avani, he's Gujarati. His father is Elliot, he's white British. I wanted to look at what happens when you have the mixture of a Gujarati heritage where those words and those experiences are just ignored, invisible.
mm,
And what happens when you have the history of the British silence around mental health. And when
mm,
you literally marry those two things and have a product and then
mm.
have someone who is both those things, and he's sort of he's almost like stuck in the middle of like a riptide between these two things.
Mm,
And he's struggling with these and unable to articulate them because he comes from a history of silence from British male mental health. He comes from a history of silence with Gujarati and South Asian lack of, vocabulary and acknowledgement of mental health. So mental health is a big theme in this book. And again, I didn't want to do it in a way that it felt overdone or glorified or, like doing it for the sake of it. Like, it was something that was really important for me. And I really wanted to talk about it in a way that felt real, but not overdone, or not done in a way that feels like I'm doing it for plot development or for the sparkly factor. Like, I wanted to do it because this is important to the story and to these characters. And it was something, again, that I had never picked up in. I'd never read a book about a Gujarati protagonist who struggles with his mental health. And I thought it was really important to depict that in British literature. And I think the last thing to say on this, from my perspective, is that, like, one of the biggest things that has moved me so much is I've had friends who've read the book, early copies of it, and they've said to me, like, seeing the way that you've portrayed mental health in this book through Eliot, through Nick, has made me want to talk to the men in my life about their mental health. It's made me notice things that you've written about, and it's made me think I need to ask them how they're doing, or take them for a walk and be like, what's going on? That to me is just like, I can't even articulate how much that means to me. If there are a few people who can find the words to talk about mental health where they've historically not been able to, because they've seen it depicted in this book, it just means so much to me.
Absolutely. I think the way that you bring mental health into the book, and as I said before, like, it's done very quietly because it's there throughout the whole novel, but nothing is made into there's no like big song and dance about like when Nick has a breakdown, or when we see actually how much Eliot is suffering. It's massive, but it's done really gently in the book, which I think is incredible, because as a reader, it's a bit easier to read, but it leaves you so reflective and a little bit shocked, but not horrified, which is an important reading process in how you can really relate to the book. And I love what you just said about the fact that Nick is from two cultures, and neither of these two cultures talk openly about mental health. And I think their reasons for not dealing with mental health are somewhat similar, but also very different. But there's so many similarities about how, we should be, as men especially, how men should always be happy and, well, not happy. They don't seem to need men to be happy, but they need men to be providing and just kind of getting on with things, and able to handle everything. It doesn't matter whether or not they're happy. Really, no one seems to ask that question. And I just think it is incredibly important to have this discourse. And I love the fact that it is brought into the book in such a deep and meaningful way. And obviously we see a change now with more kind of on social media and whatnot, more calls to talk about your mental health. But when we have decades and generations of not being able to do so and not feeling like we can, it's a change that's going to come about very slowly.
Yeah, it is. And it's sad that it's slow, but it's important that it's happening. Do you know what I mean? It's important that it's happening. And like you say, in the book, I like you use the word gentle, and I feel like that really encapsulates the way that I explore it. It's gentle. I don't want to horrify the reader, but I want to show them that these things are important to talk about, important to feel. And I feel like in real life, it is also a gentle movement towards clear articulation and providing support to people. So a lot of the way that I put this book together, I wanted it to reflect the way things happen in real life. It is contemporary realism. So like the first third of the book, or the first quarter, is quite slow and like gentle, because I wanted to reflect the state of grief that Nick is in after he's lost his grandfather. And then things pick up pace because his life is picking up pace and he's like suddenly on a quest. So I constantly wanted the pace of the book and the pace of the read to reflect the things that are being read about as well.
Absolutely. And it comes across, because it does, and I guess this kind of happens a lot with plots as well. You get to the peak and it's like so much is happening, but in Nick's life, because not only is he on this quest to uncover his family history, he's also starting university, and he's making friends or not making friends, and he's having a love interest but not having a love interest, and it's a lot, and it's also he's like 18, 19.
Yeah, 18,
So
yeah.
that's a very difficult age if things are hectic for you, and for a lot of people they're already hectic, and then you throw in 2 or 3 rounds of grief that Nick is dealing with, and the confusion in his identity, and you throw in, also trying to figure out what happened to your could have been stepdad, and all of that as well. So yeah, it's just it was great. It was done really, kind of the pace of it was good, which I think is really important as well. But one of the other things you explore a lot is identity. Obviously, Avani is Gujarati, and she's born and brought up in the UK, and then Nick is British-Gujarati, in the sense that his father is British and his mum is Gujarati. But there's a bit fairly early on where Avani talks about being Indian but not knowing India.
Yeah. I
loved it so much because then I think so many especially young people will be able to relate to it.
Yeah.
And this is set in the 80s as well, so this is even more further back. And what I found amusing throughout the book was that we keep on going back in time, but not that much had changed in so much of their experiences, and exactly. we see that a lot in life in lots of different ways.
That was something that I wanted the reader to come to the conclusion of like, with in the 80s were sorry, my maths is slow, like 30 years. There's almost a 37-year gap between like 80s and then 2017. I really hope that maths is correct. This is why I'm a writer and not a...
No, yeah, that's right. That's right.
And yeah, like I wanted to say, like, to look at, have we moved on, and how, or have we at all? Specifically, like you're talking about from an identity perspective, but also from like the way that immigrants are perceived in the UK, and racism and stuff like that. Like, have we moved on? So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because it was something that I consciously wanted to do, and I hope the reader would pick up on.
Yeah. And so so at the beginning of the novel, where it's a flashback to her in school, and someone asks her about her visiting India, and she doesn't feel like she can say, but I've never been. Yeah. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, you're actually pronouncing it wrong, but I don't know what you're talking about. And I wondered how much of your own experiences fed into that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So like, I think, like you say, it's a universal feeling when your heritage is from one place, but you've grown up in another. And specifically when the place you're growing up in is a place where your otherness is highlighted, like it happens to be for Nick when he leaves London to go to a rural town for university, and all of a sudden he's constantly feeling like his Indianness or his mixed race heritage or his brownness is like the most like attention-seeking part of it. And for Avani as well, in the 80s, the scene you're talking about, she's at a university lecture, and there's the girl who's, it's a prologue actually, there's a girl who's looking at her, and she's like, oh my God, I spent a transformative month in an ashram in India. And Avani's like, oh great, babe, let's just keep it moving, like I've never been. And I wanted to look at that because it was something that I'd felt as well a lot, like you say, in my life, where my parents are the same, well, my family's from the same heritage as the characters in the story, which is that our heritage and our roots are in Gujarat in India, but then my parents and grandparents grew up in East Africa in Kenya, because there was mass immigration from India to Kenya, or East Africa actually, mass immigration from India to East Africa after India's independence. And then when Kenya got independence, mass immigration to the UK, other parts of the world, America, back to India. So there was this twice migrant journey. And I wanted to look at the nuances of one's identity when you're from not just the place you're growing up in, not just the place that your heritage is from, but you've also had another place too. So like, to add to that again, I was born in Paris, my brother was born in Belgium, I have a Polish stepmother, my parents were born and raised in Kenya, our heritage is Indian. There's a lot going on there. But when someone asks me, where are you from? I say London, because it's where I grew up, the same way my parents will say Kenya, because that's where they grew up. And I always found that interesting as a kid, because when we were on holiday and someone was like, where are you from? And I'd be like, oh, Kenya. And I'm like, Mum, we came from Wembley. What are you like, But it's the same for me. Like when I go on holiday, I'll say London. because
Mm.
that's where, even if I've come from, if I've been living in, say, Paris for a few months, and then I go to Denmark, if someone says, "Where are you from?" I'd still say London because that's where my heart is. That's where I grew up. And I
Mm.
wanted to look at that feeling of like, how Indian do we have to be? How Kenyan do we have to be? How British do we have to be? And the answer is you can balance those things as much or as little as you want. And you can, there's no one way to perform your identity at all, your cultural identity. Every way is nuanced and every way is okay. And I think it's something that a lot of people consider when they're living in a country that, you know, they're not isn't tied to the culture that they come from.
Absolutely. And you talk a bit about in the novel where there's this bit where Avni talks about not being able to talk about her grief after loss because she has too many languages in her head.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so powerful. And she talks about, she's like, and Swahili's in there because of the East African roots, and
Yeah.
Gujarati and English, and then a bit of French because of school as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And I found it so powerful because when I was very young, I also struggled. I remember struggling a little bit at school
Yeah.
in trying to find the right words for things because it wasn't matching up in my head. But especially now that I'm older, I feel like I struggle even more with it because I have Urdu more in my life now than I did when I was at school because I'm interacting with all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons. And sometimes I have to use the Urdu word or the Punjabi word because I can't find the word in English.
Yeah,
And sometimes there
absolutely.
isn't one as well, right? There's no direct translation
Yes.
for so many things. But for Avni in the book, she talks about how it almost hinders her processing of the grief and talking
Yeah.
about her
Yeah.
loss.
Yeah.
And so where did the roots of that come from? Like, because you've just talked about all the different kind of cultures. You must have also struggled at some point. You probably still do.
Absolutely. And I had a similar thing because I grew up speaking, I think the first language I learned was Gujarati. But it
Mm,
wasn't like pure Gujarati, like what if you go to Gujarat now, it was Gujarati that, the community of Gujaratis who moved to Kenya and then to England speak. So it's speckled with Swahili words too. And
mm,
I actually don't know which bits are Swahili and which bits are Gujarati because it's
yeah.
just a language to me. But it was the same for me. And then I had to basically go to school and stop speaking Gujarati and start speaking English. And I forgot Gujarati. Then I had to relearn Gujarati. It's called first language attrition, I think, this whole phenomenon of like when you grow up learning a language and then you forget it and you have to relearn it.
Mm,
Um, but the point that you make about, you know, the words only existing in one, there's so many Gujarati words that are gorgeous that there's no English translation for. And
mm,
there's also this idea that I've read about a lot of like, when you're someone who's multilingual, you almost have a different personality in each language because the because by definition there are words that don't exist in one or the other, and because there is a way that you perform your identity in the different languages, like you do almost develop different personalities. So like some people I
mm,
know are a lot more boisterous when they speak the language of their family, but then they're a lot more calm when they speak English because they've been trained at school to be, you're being too much, be smaller, speak more,
mm,
use quieter words, be more invisible. So there's this idea of like different personalities within languages, but also, like you say, this whole really interesting idea to me of, some words not existing in other languages. Now it
mm,
comes back again to the thing we're saying about mental health, where if you're growing up in a culture where you're going through anxiety and there is no articulation of that, it doesn't exist as an idea.
mm,
How can you ever process it? How can you ever get help?
mm,
So yeah, it's a big theme throughout the novel,
mm,
language. It's a big,
mm,
big theme, communication through art, through music, through
mm.
words. It's a big, yeah. Their lack of communication as well is what's at the center of the novel.
Yeah.
Mother and son, yeah.
Yeah, I really what you just said about having different personalities in different languages, that's so fascinating. And I think so like in Urdu, and I'm sure it's probably similar in Gujarati, when it comes to like physical health, there's words that are used that when translated in English mean something else. So, for example, I don't know what the word in Urdu is for to be pregnant. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it exists. All I have ever heard is like wo bemar means she's unwell.
Oh,
Right, she's unwell. And I would never in English, I would never use that phrase.
absolutely.
And part of it is because I think of how those things are viewed culturally, and there's such a heavy context to it. But it affects also when you're then using those words, and you know that in English this means something else. It plays big games in your it makes me very confused.
It
And
does.
really also just like I find myself at times when I'm in certain contexts and speaking to certain people in a different language, I feel that and I don't feel, but I worry that whether my actual opinion of the thing is changing because I'm using words that in English mean something very different.
Yeah.
It's very complex.
It is, and this is exactly what I was guessing at. In like you were describing, I was describing like the theory, and you're now describing like the practice, and that's really nice. I think for listeners to be like, this is an example of, and I think it's something that like if you're not bilingual or you don't speak different languages or you don't come from multiple cultures and you can't, well, I think something as well that I think is like another thought that I'm having is that what we're describing here is the feeling of being outside and inside of something at the same time. We're within our culture and within the language, but we can see it juxtaposed against the other language that we speak, which is English, and see the gaps and the dissonances between the way that we talk about things, like you're saying, like pregnancy, and then the implication of that. Because so much of language as well, we just take it. So like the idea of saying, oh, she's unwell, you wouldn't think about that if that's the only language you speak in, or if you're a kid, you wouldn't think, you just take it. That's just what we say for someone who's pregnant. It's only then you have another language in your head and another culture that you think, hold on a minute, what are the implications of speaking? What are the why are we talking about pregnancy like that? Like, and it makes you think, and that's so much of what this book is about as well, is being outside of something and seeing it from the outside whilst you're still in it, you know? And that sort of weird Venn diagram of like inside and outside of a family, inside and outside of a language, the same for culture. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think I feel like it's really good that the publishing industry are creating space for books like this, which talk about things that I haven't found growing up, and that would have meant a lot to me if I picked up a book growing up that explored this sort of stuff. I would have been able to make sense of my identity and my heritage and the way that I perform those things. And I really do hope this book does that for kids, you know, or for whoever picks it up.
Yeah, I really hope so too, and I'm sure that it would. And so throughout the book, we have untranslated words and phrases in Gujarati, and I loved it actually. I think, and I love seeing it in books in general, because I'm like, yes, why do you need to provide a translation? Because if anyone really doesn't know what it is, they can go and look it up. Like it's not a huge ask, but usually we can decipher what it means through context anyway. But for me, actually, I felt like it was almost like an embracing and a celebration of Gujarati culture and community in mixed heritage. And I kind of felt like as the book went on and Nick was was exploring and understanding his own heritage a little bit more, those Gujarati phrases helped cement that, because it showed on a physical page the mixture of English and Gujarati phrases all at once. So I absolutely love that. Was it so conscious for you in that regard? And did you have any pushback?
This is a great question, and thank you for asking it, because it's something that I love talking about, and it's something that I feel is so important. So when I was studying at university, one of my tutors gave us a book called Tale of the Bluebird by Nia Wickway Parks, which is a gorgeous book. Highly recommend it. And it's set in Ghana. And in the book, Nee writes between English and Tree, and he doesn't translate, he doesn't italicize, he doesn't pander to the Western reader. He's like, this language exists alongside English, and it is as valid and it's got as much power as English. So I'm not going to other it. I'm not going to pander. I'm not going to italicize. I'm not going to provide translations. And that book blew my mind open. I was like, wow, like this is amazing. We're allowed to do this. And when I was writing this, the first draft, I'd italicized the Gujarati words as you're told to do, because that's what's always been done. And one of my peers on the course said to me, don't do that. Don't other your own language. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And then I picked up Tale of the Bluebird and I was like, yes, like this is what I'm going to do. And it was a conversation we had at Merky. You know, my editor said like, oh, do you want to provide a glossary? Do you want to translate? And I was like, absolutely not. Like, and this is why, because Gujarati and English exist in the same, they have the same amount of importance in my mind and the minds of the people I grew up with. And I want this book to reflect that. It needs to reflect, you know, it's told in close third, so it's meant to reflect the thought patterns and the thought processes of the people within it. And straight away they were totally on board, which really meant a lot to me. They were like, yeah, if that's what you want to do, let's do it. And they were and I think that's why Merky is so great as well, because I feel like there might have been other publishers who would have been like, oh, but it's going to annoy readers or it's going to make it less sellable. And they were like, no, if that's what you're doing, we're going to back you. And it meant a lot to me.
Oh, great.
That, and that it was an open conversation. And it's really, you know, I had a moment actually with the book where when I first got the first proof copy through, which is the early version, which I think was given to you, and it's like the paperback version, but it's not officially a paperback, it's a proof. I was sitting with one of my best mates sort of flicking through it, and I came across like a phrase and I was like, oh my God, this book's got Gujarati in it. I was like, oh, it's my book. And it was like, because we'd been like, you know, we'd had like a 3 or 4 hour conversation. It was late at night and I was sort of flicking through it. And I was like, oh my God, like I've just had a moment where I realized how rare this is and how much it will mean to people to pick up a book and recognize their own language on a British bookshelf alongside English. So yeah, there's a lot of Gujarati, but none of it. I always within the same page, I will always have a direct translation, but just not in a way that's obvious. It is always clear what we're talking about, and the reader will never miss out on anything. But the Gujarati reader might just get a little bit of an extra sparkle of being able to recognize a word that they've grown up with. But there's no direct translation, but the reader won't really be missing out on anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this there is a movement we're seeing in literature and publishing of essentially decolonizing literature, which is saying, why does my book need to pander to the white audience and the English speaker only? Like, why is it that if I'm writing about a Gujarati family or I'm a Vietnamese family or a Pakistani family, it doesn't make sense that everything has to be in English. Like, it just doesn't, it's not authentic, it's not real. Surely it's fine to present it exactly how it is. And I think it's such an important movement as well, because there are readers all around the world and communities that are going to relate to different things. And I feel like when we have such direct translations, it can sometimes feel strange as well to read it, because you're not looking at a dictionary, you're not looking at a glossary. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely love it. I'm so glad that it's in there, and I do hope that we continue to see more of it. And it's really nice to hear that Merky was so supportive of that. Obviously, they're an imprint of Penguin, which is a huge publisher. Absolutely. So it's a great movement, I think. Absolutely. We also, Nick actually has a really important reflection in the book where he talks about the difference in being asked where we're from, or how heavy that can sometimes be. And he says, you know, there's a huge difference when we're being asked by other people of color, or when we're being asked by white people. And he says, you know, the former rings of solidarity, allyship, while the latter of othering and of suspicion. And I think that's something that many of us relate to, and we're constantly seeing it. I mean, there was recently, and yeah, I mean, I was so glad to see it so kind of nuancedly put in the book. And just to be able to say that this is why it's an issue, and that there is this difference. And if you're asking me in order to kind of have more ammunition for your othering of me.
Absolutely.
I don't want to tell you, I don't want to talk to you about it. But if you're asking me because it's going to help you relate to me a little bit more,
Absolutely.
and if it means that we can be friends, and of course, let's talk about it. I'll tell you about my time in India. Let's do it.
Absolutely. And that is something that I pretty much, most of the interviews I've had have brought up that passage. And I describe his identity as like a pair of scales, and the weight of the answer that he gives depends on the intention of the person asking him the question. And like you say, if he's asked by someone who's white, mate, where are you from? Like, it feels like they're saying, what kind of different are you?
Exactly.
Whereas when it's someone who's also a minority, they're saying, what's our point of connection? How
Yes.
both alike in our difference, And obviously it's important to say there are plenty of white people who will ask that question in a way that feels kind and genuine and like they really just want to get to know someone. But I think it's also important to say that there is a way to ask someone, and it's important to think about why you're asking someone where they're from. If you're someone who yourself is not from a minority background, why is it important to you to have to box someone into that? I want people to think about the other ways to ask about someone's heritage as opposed to where are you from? Because where are you from has got this whole sensation around it of belonging. And when you're from multiple places, often it is a difficult question to answer because you do for a big part of your life, like you might not know where you belong. And a lot of your life, like it is for Nick and Avani, is figuring out where they belong, both within their families and within their cultural heritages. And I just wanted to open up that conversation a bit and try and express why it sometimes feels difficult to answer, and why other times it feels beautiful to answer, and what that difference is, So thank you for bringing that up. I'm glad that we could talk about that because I feel like it's something that it means a lot that people are resonating. It's resonating.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the question, where are you from? It almost feels dud now, especially, there's those adverts for like or find out about your genealogy.
Yeah.
And then people are like, oh, I have a 7th cousin from Italy, or actually I'm like 1/14 Lebanese or something. And it actually shows that if you open your mind a little bit, you'll realize that none of us are actually from anywhere, right? Like the communities have been global and nomadic and traveling since the beginning of time. And it feels so almost a little bit arrogant to be able to say, well, I'm from one place. Actually, I'm from this planet. I'm from this world.
I know. This is
but
exactly
I was born here and I grew up here. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think it's really interesting because I lived in South India. So Gujarat is obviously the north, but my dad, my mum, my brother and I lived briefly in Bangalore when we were growing up. And I went to an international school. And I think now of the kids that I went to that school with, who a lot of them were white. And they would say, I'm from India. But then there are lots of brown people in the UK like me. If someone asked me that, I'll say I'm from London. And when someone's asking that question with the wrong intention, they will want to continue to dig.
Exactly.
Because they won't be happy with that. They're like, what do you mean you're Indian, you're white? Or what do you mean you're a Londoner, you're brown? And I wanted to look at that. And also, it's something that I've struggled with in my life because I, like Nick, grew up in London, and I, like Nick, went to a rural place for university. And I would be asked, where are you from there? And I would be asked in London by people, and I'd say, I'm from Wembley, mate, where are you from? And it would be fine. But when I was in a rural town, I'd say London, and they'd say, oh, where did your parents grow up? And I'd say, well, Kenya. So you're Kenyan? I'm like, no. And they were like, where are you born? Paris. Oh, so you're French? I'm like, no. And I'm like, oh, are you trying to figure out what kind of brown I am? Because if that's
exactly,
the answer is Indian. And I remember feeling so upset with myself for being upset. I'd be like, is this something, am I shy about being Indian? I'd be upset with myself for not being able to answer their question as Indian. But the answer isn't Indian. The answer is that I'm from London because I'm a Londoner. My heritage is Indian and I'm Gujarati, and part of me, yes, is Indian. But I remember feeling this great deal of like weight on my shoulders when people were asking me, and then I'd be hard on myself. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that for lots of people, it's not a clear-cut answer. And when you ask, where are you from? And you're asking them, where do you belong? It's a different question to what is your heritage?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's something, that's again a big theme in this book for me and Nick.
Because that question makes so many essentially, you know that it's kind of like, are you accepted here? Is another way of phrasing that question, right? Are you accepted here? And so when you're asked it, especially I think when you're at Nick's age, when you're asked it, there's almost an intrinsic kind of, you feel the need to prove that you're British.
Absolutely.
And I feel like so much, like looking back now at my own life, I feel so embarrassed now at how many occasions I had reduced the Pakistani part of my identity.
Absolutely. And me too. And me too. And this is something that I look at in the book, this idea of like, how Indian are we? How Pakistani are we? How British are we? You know, and this idea of like, the answer is London because that's where he relates to. But the answer is also, of course, India. But he doesn't, you know, coming back to the quote from Avani, like they don't really know India. We know it in the way that they perform their Indianness, which is for Nick, his inability to speak proper Gujarati, his love of the Mahabharat, his addiction to rasmalai and jalebi. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's his Indianness. And I feel the same thing as you. Like when I was just speaking a minute ago about when people would ask me where I'm from, I would feel like I would almost do this weird tango with them and being like, I know what you're asking me, which is what kind of brown are you? So I'm going to give you a hard time. But in that, I would be reducing my Indianness. And in that, I would feel a sense of shame. And it is such a weight. And this is what I'm trying to get across is like when you ask someone that question who is from many places and who hasn't had the privilege of being born in a country where all of their family are from and where they always live, there is so much going on in that person's mind. And it's important to be mindful of that and to be respectful of that and to interrogate why it's important for you to ask that question and what you're really expecting from the answer. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that I explore with Nick and Avani too. And it's something that I, like you, have totally felt. This feeling of like wanting to put the person who's asking you on the spot a bit, but then yourself, you feel like you're leaving a part of yourself behind.
Yeah. That you're like shrinking a part of yourself, or you're like, you know, anglicizing it in many ways as well. So I mean, honestly, like I'm so glad that it was in there, and it, because so many people will, like me, will be able to relate to it. And I hope it helps people asking the question really think about why they're asking it and the impact that they're able to have. And so we've talked a bit about how, you know, your own experiences, some of your own experiences have fed into the characters. Which character was your favorite to write?
Oh, that's such a nice question. I think from like a writerly stretching me way, Avani was really interesting because she's so complex. So from like a technique way, I think I grew a lot as a writer through writing about Avani. But certainly my favorite characters to write were the grandfather Bapu Rohan, however you want to refer to him, Elliot, and also Papa Burns, who's Will's father, who helps Nick out. Because all three of them are men who are sensitive and deep and kind. And it was such a joy to me, such a joy for me to bring men like that into literature because they exist. But I feel like it's so rare to see like intimacy platonically between men in books. And whenever I come across it in films and books, my heart just like glows. I'm like, yes, like we need more of this. We need to make it okay and normalized to see men being sweet and kind and tender with each other in a platonic way. Like, you know, it's beautiful when we see relationships with men in books, but you know, I want to see that intimacy depicted. And with all three of those characters, I was able to do that. You know, Rohan has that certainly with Nick. And I love Papa Burns, like Will's dad, you know, the way that he's so tender with Nick too, and the way he calls him son and the way he comes and helps him. So the men were definitely, I think, like the tenderness between the men, I think their characters and the characterization and like the relationships between them was definitely my favorite thing to write. And it's the thing that still warms me. Weirdly, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that as the author, but when I come across it, I'm like, oh yeah, like, you know, it's nice to experience that in the book, I think.
I think it's really interesting because we see female friendships celebrated in books. Probably not enough, but we see them celebrated in books and film. We also see women pitted against each other in the way we don't tend to see men pitted against each other. But yeah, we don't see, now that I think about it, we don't see enough of male friendships. And like that has led to me in my personal life being very confused about what kind of friendships men have, because I don't know. And I'm married, but I still don't really know what to expect from my husband and his friendship with men. And sometimes if he doesn't see anybody for weeks at a time, any of his friends, I keep asking myself, like, is that normal? Is this just how do men just not have friends? Because I have no reference point. I don't know.
And this is exactly it, because we've been socialized to focus on female friendships or relationships through the art and the film and the books we've read, but we've not been socialized to see that in books, which is again why I wanted to put it in books. And again, it links to the big theme in the book of male mental health and male friendships and how those things feed into each other. And it was really important to me. A lot of people describe this book, I won't say a lot of people, but the book has been described more times than I would like as a tragic novel. And for me, it's not a tragic novel. It's a novel about resilience and love and friendship and hope and relationships, but above all about resilience. And a big theme as well, like we've touched on, is friendship. And friends are a big part of my life. Like my friends, like for Nick, are the people who hold me up and the people who have got me through stuff and the people who I go to first. Like I am so incredibly fortunate to have the friend group that I have, and I owe so much to them. And I wanted to bring that into literature as well and show like the power of friendship and how much it can mean and how it can, you know, hold people up like it does for Nick when he doesn't have anything else, when he's not speaking to his mother, when he's lost, you know, his grandfather, when he doesn't know his dad, when he doesn't really have family to turn to. His friends are the ones who keep him whole. And that was something that I really wanted to bring to books and wanted to explore in this one.
Yeah, it was really nicely done. We do see Nick's friends rallying around him and asking the right questions at the right time. Like they don't leave it too late. Like they know that something's gone down and they're just like, right, we need to fix it. And they do. It's really, really wholesome. What message would you like to give to especially young people who may not be feeling particularly seen in literature or just in general? Because I feel like through your book, so many people will be feeling seen, and they don't have to be Gujarati or even mixed race. I think in so many different ways, people will be feeling seen. But what would you really like to say?
So thank you for that. That's a really like a beautiful thing to say, and I do hope that's true. And for anyone who like has grown up, you know, particularly our generation or the generations above us, and hopefully less so the generations below us, I think things are changing. The fact that this book is even published is a change, you know. I would say that like there is hope, because it does feel like slowly in film, in literature, in art, space is being made. You know, I think a lot of my favorite pieces of art or books in the last couple of years have brought experiences to literature, to bookshelves, to TV that haven't historically been depicted. My favorite photographer, Tyler Mitchell, photographs like Black bodies in a state of ease and pleasure, which historically hasn't been done in art. And I think of like, I mentioned like Caleb Zuma Nelson's Open Water, which looks at a British Ghanaian man like just living his life in London, and just you know, it's a very literary, beautiful book. And again, I hadn't seen a lot of literary fiction where a Black male character was allowed to exist like that. And things are changing. Things are changing. So I'd say like look out for books, look out for films, and support those writers, support those creators, because like the more room that is made, the more space that exists by definition for us to continue creating that art, and for more people to come join us in creating the art to depict different voices and cultures and heritages. So I'd say, you know, it does feel like things are changing, and I just really hope that continues.
Yeah, me too. And what if there was one thing that you really wanted to achieve with your book and your writing more generally, what is that?
So the reason I wrote this book was to connect with people. And I wrote it thinking it would not be published. And when it did get published, when I did win the book deal, I thought, it's just going to go on the radar. It'll be like a quiet book. So it has been such an unbelievable joy to see it being celebrated so much and to do things like this with you where I can talk about it and to see it just, doing well, essentially. But coming back to it, like I didn't write it for any of those things. I wrote it from a very quiet part of me that just wanted me and my friends and my heritage, and the way that I speak to my mates is the way that Nick speaks to his mates, and the way that Avani speaks to her friends is the way that I see my aunties and my parents and stuff speak to their mates. And I just wanted to bring representation. I wanted us to be allowed to exist in this thing that I love so much, which is literature, because I've always inhaled books. I've read so much. I have 2 degrees in literature, but I never came across a British-Gujarati family living in Northwest London. And I just wanted to do that. I wanted to connect. And it wasn't just the Gujarati community I wanted to connect with. I wanted to connect with, someone who lives in a village in Scotland who would pick this up and hasn't been able to talk about their mental health. I wanted to connect with a mother somewhere who hasn't been able to talk to her son about something. I wanted to connect with a young kid at university who, like me, was struggling, who, like Nick, struggles, to find solace and to be like, uni is not always the dream. Like sometimes it's really hard. I wrote about it because I wanted to connect, and I really hope that's what it does. That it connects with people and it makes people feel seen and it makes people feel held. That's what I hope for.
Oh, that's really nice. I share your hopes for your book, and I'm sure you've come a long way in achieving a lot of those as well already. Are you working on anything now? What can we expect from you going forwards?
So I am slowly working on the next book, which is also going to follow a British Gujarati family. It's also going to be set around London. It's going to have a female protagonist this time who's in between Nick and Avani's age. So she's closer to my age, like late 20s. I just turned 30, but like late 20s. Yeah, like I also had a couple of short stories published the last couple of years. So one called Break 2 years ago, and then last year I had a short story published called Once, which you can read in the Bristol Short Story Prize anthology. All of my writing looks at relationships, identity, layers, the stories we tell ourselves. It's all very much to do with like psychology and the human experience, and my next book will be the same. I'm really hoping to also have another short story published this year, because I like having like one go out each year. So hopefully the next thing, it's a very long answer, but to summarize, will be another short story published this year, and then hopefully another book soon too.
That's very exciting. That's really exciting. Well, Jyoti, I would love to carry on talking to you, but I'm very conscious of the time. And it is a Sunday that we're recording, so I don't want to eat too much of your time. But it has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. And congratulations once again on the publication of All the Things That We Lost.
Thank you so much. Honestly, it's been such an absolute joy talking to you, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to. So thank you.
Thank you so much to Jyoti for such a fun, insightful, and interesting conversation. I loved it. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.